Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest talk from the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. I'm Elliot Borenstein. I'm Professor of Russian Slavic Studies and Vice Chancellor and Vice Provost for Global Programs. And it is my pleasure to introduce Philip Tuxbury-Gleisner, Assistant, almost Associate Professor at Ohio State University. He is already the author of several books. Most importantly, your book is out now, right?
You can buy it in May.
You can buy it in
It's
May.
listed.
You can
pre-order.
You can pre-order. Yes, smash the like button. And pre-order to Subscribe Me to Sovietum, The Lives of the Socialist Literary Journal, coming out with University of Toronto Press in May, so you can pre-order. He is also the co-editor with Bradley Gorski of Red Migrations, Transnational Mobility and Leftist Culture After 1917, also Toronto. Co-editor with Harry Eli Kashdam of Resilient Kitchens, American Immigrant Cooking in a Time of Crisis, Essays and Recipes. This is one of the best COVID projects I've read since, I guess, COVID. And with Michael Wachtel, he is a co-editor of a book about Vyacheslav Ivanov, and I'm not going to try the German because I passed the German exam in graduate school, but that was it. He also has a number of wonderful digital projects. He actually is a digital humanist, so sometimes you can ask him what digital humanities are, and we can find out. He has the COVID Food Archive, Queer is That, an index of post-Soviet queer publishing, Soviet Journals Reconnected, and Digital Emigre, a metadata collection of the periodicals Contingent and Syntax, these two of the most important emigre journals of the late Soviet period. His talk today, which is from his forthcoming book, is entitled The Lives of the Socialist Literary Journal, Embedded Modes of Independent Culture Under State Socialism. So welcome, Philip.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much, Elliot, for this kind introduction, and of course the kind invitation, as well as Sasha Shvitanik and Fatuma Keita for all the help with the logistics.
For 1 second, for
Yes.
some reason the
Oh, no.
presentation is
Yeah.
Did it? It's still sharing.
Zoom may have just ended on this screen for some reason. No, it's
Huh.
there. Where'd it go?
Oh,
Okay,
there it is.
Sorry.
Okay,
I guess we're still there.
Here, we're continuing. So it is a great pleasure to be able to share some of my work with you today in person, which still feels like, speaking of COVID, still feels like a special treat. Maybe we can just kind of keep that feeling alive. In this lecture, I will present an overarching idea from my monograph coming out in May, as Elliot mentioned, an attempt to write a history of this media archetype, the Socialist Literary Journal, as a unique cultural form of East European and especially Soviet state socialism in the 20th century, holistically rather than with a focus on one isolated publication. And of course, several foundational studies of individual journals have been undertaken already, each one of them offering conclusions about the uniqueness of their periodicals, something surprising. The same applies to the numerous memoiristic and essayistic pieces reminiscing about one publication or the other. Each one of them seems surprised by its discovery of the respective periodicals' independence from the socialist cultural and political mainstream. Permitted Dissent in the USSR, Novi Mir and the Soviet regime, for instance, is the title of a study of the long-lived periodical New World. Russian nationalism and the politics of Soviet literature, in the case of Nash Savremennik, is the title of a study of the journal Our Contemporary that reveals the publication as an outlier, spearheading the development of Russian nationalist political sentiment. In an essay about the monthly for foreign literature and translation, Inostranная literatura, Joseph Brodsky refers to his personal window to the world, a window that he eventually fell out of, as he says. The same somewhat exhausted metaphor also appears in the academic analysis of the East German publisher Volk und die Welt, whereas the socialist Czechoslovak publisher Odeon and the Czechoslovak publisher Odeon and its journal Světová literatura has been discussed as an island of freedom. The exceptionalities of journals and their publishers is thus found across the literary histories of the Soviet bloc, raising an important question. What of the exceptionality of the literary periodical and in some cases of literary publishers at large? What if this exception is actually the rule? What if specifically the periodical as an institution of cultural production, as a site of reception, and as a medium, had as one of its core features the creation of an autonomous kind of negotiating social belonging, political ideas, even geopolitics and culture? In today's talk, I will explore this question through the focus on these three dimensions around a cluster of case studies, some more famous, others less known, several Soviet examples, and one Czechoslovak. But before we dive into this, some conceptual clarifications may be in order. What do I mean by socialist literary journal? A media archetype that those familiar with Russian and Soviet culture may also refer to as the thick journal, толстый журнал. Importantly, however, these journals embraced more than literature, a facet reflected in their official genre denominator, the literary, artistic, and socio-political journal, литературно-художественный общественно-политический журнал. The bureaucratic sounding identifier here, that's why I always like to repeat it for its bureaucratic sound, became broadly accepted from the 1930s onward, the hyphenated titles abounding in the history of Soviet journals. The Soviet Literary Journal, the Socialist Literary Journal, in other words, was a periodical, most commonly a monthly, of literature plus X. At a bare minimum, it included literary criticism as that X, but more often than not, it also featured contributions on other arts, long-form journalism, social commentary, as well as a grab bag of categories. Cultural news, reproduction of visual arts, chess problems, humor and satire, even sports and household advice. Much like the realist novel, painting, it is a cultural form inherited from the pre-revolutionary era, the 19th century, and it was inherited with such self-evidence that we rarely ponder this consequential choice over other options for the preferred mechanism for the selection, consecration, and circulation of literature that would be fit for a utopian future. Not the book, not the literary text disseminated by sound, say on the radio, not the literary text featured in the newspaper, but the dignified review journal. With press runs in the tens of and hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions during the Soviet era, it developed somewhat of its own life, went through various iterations in the Soviet Union and after World War II in other parts of Eastern Europe. This is what I refer to in the title of my book, The Lives of the Socialist Literary Journal. Today, I hope to make this life tangible in my discussion of three separate, although closely entangled, and you'll notice they're kind of bleeding into each other, closely entangled takes on the periodical, the lens of the community of authors, that is, the periodical as an institution of cultural production, the lens of the reader, that is, of periodicals as sites for literary reception, and the lens of the media format as such. That's why I brought this. The paper project that we have right in front, paper object that we have right in front of us. So this is the whole reason I brought this from just now. Actually, I can send it around. It becomes relevant later. So if you have to look at least at one that you probably haven't seen before. Okay. So part one. The periodical as an institution of kinship, the cases of Юность and Наш современник. In a moment. In the late 1950s, a new wave of literary journals appeared in the Soviet Union, and with them a question got more and more pressing of how one would introduce distinction amongst them. After all, they did not operate in a field of unique and competing aesthetic and ideological visions, but if at all, they introduced nuance within that Soviet cultural system. Yet once the institutional framework of the landscape of periodicals was there, it generated a social organization of the literary press into different and increasingly discrete groups. To make this development visible, tangible, I've conducted a computational analysis. This is what Elliot referenced earlier. Soviet Journals Reconnected was that digital humanities project from a couple of years ago. So a computational analysis of bibliographical data, of information on all contributors and their contributions from the late 50s to the early 70s for a sample set of journals. So what's the logic here? I tried to figure out what kind of shared communities of authors, right? So we're moving from here, right? Two journals share an author. By virtue of that, they somehow have a kind of connection. The more authors you share, the more connected you are. And here's kind of a landscape of just the 6 journals that I talked about. What I'm most interested in today, though, is not even this landscape, but I'm interested in this diachronic take. What the analysis revealed was a kind of centrifugal force. Over the 60s, it became increasingly less likely that an author would publish in more than one journal, making every title of the Soviet literary press thus more distinct from its competitors. And I can address kind of the exemptions here later if you're very interested. There are reasons, but again, the general tendency that we're looking for is less likely if you want to read one author. You will more and more likely find that same person in the same place. But what fueled this development? I call the phenomenon periodical kinship, a unique kind of belonging to a specific journal and its community that mirrors the communities of kins relying on shared traits within one such communities and notions of exclusivity toward others. Notes, protocols of editorial meetings document how this belonging to a journal functioned. Importantly, in both directions, from author to journal and journal to author, bearing witness to internal institutional mechanisms, these archival documents reveal as much. For instance, for the journal Unist in the 1960s. When Unist was subjected to pressure from the outside, it tended to defend its authors, these records show. For example, in 1961, Vasily Aksionov became the target of harsh polemics on account of his novel Ticket to the Stars, published in Unist 6 and 761. The novel, if you haven't read it, it depicts a group of young people who moved from Moscow to Estonia to live kind of a carefree life by the sea. Ultimately, they turn into productive members of socialist society after all. But the novel also leaves some uncertainty from an ideological perspective because one of this kind of more likable characters actually fails. The text also reflected contemporary youth jargon and the fashion and music of that young generation, all of which seemed to upset Soviet critics. And Unist, in response, hosted an extensive meeting in October '61 to discuss Aksionov's text and address some of the objections. Around 90 pages in length, the resulting transcript documents how the participants engaged with criticism and readers' reactions, carefully weighing arguments. Most of the editors and authors affiliated with Unist defended Aksionov, which was not surprising. In the case of representatives of Aksionov's generation, of course, but even older and more conservative members of the editorial board stepped up in his defense. For example, Maria Priležaeva, one of them, declared nonchalantly, I quote here, "I didn't know that we would discuss Aksionov's novel today." Imagine coming to a meeting like that. "I didn't know that we would discuss Aksionov's novel today and didn't prepare for the conversation, didn't read Aksionov's novel in the form that was published in the journal, but I remember my impression of the manuscript. First and foremost, I would like to say that after all those critical articles, as a member of the journal's editorial board, I am required to tell my judgment about the manuscript. And even now, I would say that the piece needs to be published." End of quote. This is not to say that none of the members of the editorial board rejected Aksionov's novel. It simply seems that the only ones who did had been critical from the outset. No one really changed their minds. The polemical debate that followed the publication in the Soviet press did not seem to have any profound impact either way. It is telling that Priležaeva, whom I just cited, a significant long-term presence in Unist, did not even go back to examine the text again. She adhered to her judgment, emphasizing that she saw talent in Aksionov, which is the only significant criterion. And while the journal's managing editor, Sergei Preobrazhensky, agreed with much of the criticism, urging Aksionov to work hard on improving his writing, he confirmed the publication's, that is, Unist's commitment to the author. I quote, "We expect new work from Vasily Aksionov. We consider him our young and talented writer, and we will try to provide him with all the necessary support to allow him to start working on a new topic this year, in the nearest future." End of quote. The loyalty and commitment of the journal to the author had the power to resist outside pressures. What is constantly negotiated here is what we might call the mutuality of being between author and journal, both as an institution and as a community of editors and authors. Looked at as a community of kin, their conjoined existence is involved in taking responsibility for the wrongful acts of relatives as well, as recent research in kinship by Marshall Solins has proposed. Once kinship and affiliation are established for a journal, it also becomes a category of exclusion, which is the flip side of that same coin. Here we go for exclude that. Somehow I wasn't drawn into the editorial office of Novy Mir, wrote Sergei Vikulov, laconically and without much explanation in his memoir titled In the Russian Direction, Notes of the Chief Editor of Nash Savremennik. The book describes his involvement in the thick journal in the 1960s and his later work as chief editor of Our Contemporary, shaping the journal's quote-unquote Russian direction, what I mentioned earlier. Vikulov frames the choice of journals that would determine his future career as an editor in a negative mode, as a decision about where do I not belong, right? The memoir presents this choice as, again, self-evident, without clarifying it in terms of aesthetics or politics, leaving the reader to conclude that being different from Novy Mir was a systemic necessity. Claude Lévi-Strauss' theory of kinship discusses so-called moiety systems as a form of organization in which two ritually separate communities live next to each other. They rely on each other's difference as the foundation of their personal perpetual existence, right? Dual organization is the expression on an institutional plane of a system of kinship which itself derives from certain rules of alliance. Well, this coexistence is not oriented toward achieving dominance. So the idea is not, the two cannot merge, but it's also not about one winning over the other. The continued presence of both groups provides the foundation for the system, and of course, Lévi-Strauss for marriage, procreation. Periodical kinship departed from conceptualization of kinship with Lévi-Strauss in that respect, because, of course, we're not talking about marriage. The separation between groups was a central foundation and a challenge to the journal's continued existence. So it wasn't about exchange as much, but about purity, nonetheless. Vikulov's memoir, too, was not outright dismissive of Novy Mir, and this is important. He even fashioned himself, Vikulov, thought he was the intellectual heir of Novy Mir's chief editor, Alexander Twardowski, presumptuously so, one may add. Ultimately, he needed Novy Mir as a distinctive other to justify the continued existence of his own community. So where is the discussion of archival documents in UNIST? Go. So far has shown the mechanisms of belonging. The editorial archive of Nash Savremennik can serve to demonstrate an interesting instance of negotiation of non-belonging. A conflict between chief editor Boris Zubavin, so this was before Vikulov's time, right, and his deputy Konstantin Bukovsky occurred in the winter of 60-61 and was debated over two tense meetings of the editorial team. So here's the story. Zubavin had translated into Russian the novella The Only One by an author named Yuri Zbanatsky, published in the original Ukrainian in 1958. It was slotted to appear in the final 1960 issue of Nash Savremennik, and at the October 1960 meeting, Bukovsky objected to this, for several reasons, both literary and logistical. First, the journal was not in the habit of publishing longer pieces from the republics. That was the job of Družba Narodov. Second, it did not fit thematically, which was another journal, so I should have added that. Second, it did not fit thematically, since it was, and I quote here, about the war, prison, and the concentration camp, that is already historical, end quote. Nash Savremennik was supposed to be about contemporary stuff. They didn't really succeed about that in the long run, but that was the claim. Finally, its proposed serialization over two issues, the final one of 1960 and the first one of 61, would span two subscription cycles of the journal. And thus, it would be really annoying to readers. Imagine you didn't renew your subscription, you'd be kind of left hanging. Ultimately, the notes from this meeting state, it was decided to publish a shortened version of Zubavin's translation in the first 1961 issue, and at this point, it appears that the negotiation of specific literary qualities, editorial logistics, was concluded and done with. But the end of the protocol, when you go to the archive, it features a handwritten note by Bukovsky stating that he had signed this document, approved the meeting notes before the solution regarding this text was added, and this is where the scandal starts. Finally. Okay. The stenographic transcript of the following meeting reveals a serious escalation of the conflict. Zubavin reports that at an evening at the House of Writers, Dom Literaturov in Moscow, Bukovsky, in front of several other writers, had drunkenly, and I quote here, offended me, calling me a piece of shit, said that he did not want to work for me and that I had opened a feeding trough in the editorial office at redakции. I would like an explanation of what this feeding trough entails. I understand that there can be no more friendly relations after this. While Bukovsky was ready to apologize for his abuse, he persisted in his observation about the feeding trough and subsequently defined his position in a note prepared for the Writers' Union announcing his departure from the journal. I quote again, in the first issue, the editor Zubavin is placing his translation of a novella by Zbanatsky, which already appeared in Ukraine a long time ago. I do not want to be a witness to how a publication that is dear to me is turning into a simple source of padding one's income. Therefore, I am requesting to be relieved of my responsibilities as the deputy editor of the journal. Indeed, he kind of had a point there. Zubavin was what we would call double dipping, because he was collecting royalties for his translation twice, once for the journal publication and once for the book publication that was already scheduled. This is part of kind of one of the intricacies of the Soviet publishing system. On the other hand, another attendee at the meeting pointed out that the publication of editors' work was common practice, and one might add here, often enough, it was thought of as desirable. If you're an editor for that journal, you're supposed to contribute, right? You get a rally. Several members of the editorial team understandably found Bukovsky guilty of lacking collegiality in general, and Viktor Poltoradsky characterized him as a selfish, extremely selfish man, opposing not just the chief editor, but the whole editorial team, end of quote. Boris Biedny added, you're somewhat trying to be diplomatic, resorting to Machiavellian tactics. I get the sense that this is a ploy, end of quote. So unsurprisingly, Bukovsky's participation in the journal ended. And of all records of editorial meetings that I have seen in archives, this one certainly stands out for its kind of harshness. At the same time, I believe it illustrates an important point. Belonging and non-belonging, loyalty and aversion, were negotiated within the journal families at the intercept of literary merit. Was Zbanatsky's text new and valid? Kind of was it worth publishing? Institutional procedure and logistics, can we do this over kind of the year gap? And personal relationships. And that is a pattern of how these journals operated. To some extent, and this is also important, these relationships were sheltered from external intervention, lent an independent mode of social existence to the journal that impacted its constitution as a community and ultimately its shape in terms of the materials featured and what the reader got in the end. This mode found its parallel in readerly engagement. That similarly had its core notions of belonging and ties between reader and journal that added up to more than the ties between a consumer and a producer of goods, as I will demonstrate in the following based on examples from another journal, Иностранная литература. While the mechanisms of identification and experiences of belonging can be found in many journals, Иностранная литература added a further dimension. As a journal for literature and translation, it offered itself not just as a literary institution, but truly as a way for readers to connect to the rest of the world, as my analysis of archival correspondence in the following will demonstrate. And I have made a point of choosing a more peaceful example. So, part 2, the periodical as a site of literary reception, the readers of Иностранная литература. The archive of the journal Иностранная литература is filled with letters displaying a common sentiment of identification among readers who felt inclined to turn to the editors not just of a journal, but their journal. Many applauded the editor's work before launching into long lists of works they wished to see in the journal. Frequently, letters complained about the publication of texts, predominantly Western ones, that did not fit their literary taste, or on the contrary, they complained about the dominance and materials the readers declared irrelevant, and then oftentimes literatures of the Eastern Bloc or the Global South. Some correspondents displayed great erudition, knowledge, as well as pedantry, correcting factual correcting factual errors, and lecturing the editors about inaccuracies in translations, whereas other letter writers struggled with the spelling of names, titles, and communicative conventions in general. And this is to say, to preempt the common question, are these letters fabricated? No, it would have taken a lot of labor and to come up with something with such a set of materials, right? These are genuine responses from Soviet leaders. The reader's reception was shaped directly by what we may call the journal's paratext. All the textual and visual elements accompanying its literary content. They impacted this reception in at times unexpected ways. Forwards and afterwards to literary texts, for example, addressed an assumed horizon of expectation, an assumed horizon of reading. In other words, readerly expectations that were subjected to manipulation and readjustment. You had to manage the reader's perception or reception. The paratextual elements in Иностранная литература evolved over the years. Beginning in 1971, photos of the authors accompanied texts, making these authors a more personal presence on the page. In introductory notes, these authors directly addressed the Soviet reader. Here's one such example. The Hungarian author Lajos Mesterházy, for instance, turned to his Russian-speaking audience in a foreword to the 1976 publication of his novel, The Prometheus Enigma. Has anyone read that? I would have been very surprised, but you never know. And he expressed his joy at the Russian translation and explaining his somewhat unusual choice of topic, because as a Marxist Hungarian author, Mesterházy was known for his realist novels on contemporary and historical problems of the 20th century, but this novel about Prometheus was an exception, a creative investigation of the Prometheus myth, which of course, to some extent bore its own symbolic significance for communist modernity. In any event, the Prometheus Enigma was a great success of the 70s. Not only the choice of subject, but also Mesterházy's treatment was uncommon, a mix of historical authority, irony, and a personal involvement that connected the author in his detective work about Prometheus to the inspired Soviet reader. The Prometheus Enigma, you might want to read it after this, was an absorptive emotional experience, for the narrator invited his readers to join in the creative process. In the introduction, he wrote how he could attain his aim of making a contribution to the improvement of nothing less than human life in the world, like Prometheus. And here I quote, "In case the reader takes a fancy for what I have written, if he goes hand in hand with me," end of quote. Indeed, this publication seemed to inspire in readers an equally personal engagement with the text and its author. They developed their own transnational imaginations, ways in which they envisioned themselves as part of the journal's community, crossing national borders. You might have guessed where this goes. As Benedict Anderson has famously argued, all national communities are imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each other lives the image of their communion, Anderson says. The same may be said of the transnational communities that readers established through their letters. They repeatedly expressed a feeling of personal connectedness to the author that drew from text and paratextual components. For example, a reader from Tashkent wrote, while reading, "I returned several times to the page where the portrait of the author is inserted. I wanted to find access to the author of this galvanizing novel, to understand and get to know him closely. High forehead, wide nose, heavy eyelids." I mean, it's true, if you can see it up there. He was born in 1916. In other words, he is 60 years old. End of quote. Just as Mesterházy wanted to take his readers by their hands, here too the encounter between reader and writer had a quasi-physical nature, focusing on physiognomy as a means for psychological understanding, right? While some readers simply expressed their gratitude to the editors or asked them to convey their regards to the author, others addressed their letters directly to him, such as one reader from Leningrad. "Dear Mesterházy, I hope it will not disturb you that the novel The Prometheus Enigma prompted in me a great feeling of involvement in the issue of high humanism, created the great and vivid pleasure of a dialogue with you, with your thoughts, your heroes. The images in the novel are magnificent. Again, pleasure was experienced in a contact with the author, right? Even a kind of kinship, we might again say, that mirrored the relations between authors and editors discussed earlier. Readers in their letters continued an imagined exchange that had originated in the journal. For many of them, the personal connection was directly linked to the urge to pursue serious intellectual conversations. One reader described how she had consulted Nikolai Kuhn's Legends and Myths of Ancient Greece, after which she concluded that everything Mesterhazy wrote in his novel was audaciously brave but true. If only I could have a talk with the author! Exclamation. The incident of the Prometheus Enigma showed that the text and the author's personality provided a foundation for readers to experience literature as a form of participating in transnational intellectual community. In many readers' letters, Mesterhazy figured as one of their favorite authors among many others, which they tended to enumerate quite extensively. There was a lot of list making involved in these letters. For example, I cannot imagine myself without my love for Gogol, Goncharov, Chekhov, and many, many other Russian Soviet writers and poets. I read and reread the articles of Belinsky and recently read The Young Guard, that is Fadeyev's novel, with nothing short of a teenager's excitement. Similarly, I can't imagine myself without my love for Faulkner, Strittmatter, Amado, Aldridge, Mesterhazy, Marquez. Letters often included these long lists, commonly expressing affective attachment and a keen interest in reading additional works by these authors. Here, Mesterhazy is put in a row with American William Faulkner and all these other people I just mentioned, without any sign of ideological linkage or categorization. Similar lists could be extracted from many letters, referring to much of the Western as well as the socialist contemporary canon, often clustered around certain authors who tended to be highlighted in the journal at the time. On the one hand, this was a way for readers to demonstrate their knowledge and erudition, right? Expressing a strong urge for encyclopedic literary knowledge, much as Lenin had exhorted the population to, as he said, enrich your minds with the knowledge of all the treasures created by mankind. Indeed, the verbs of acquaintance or getting to know, ознакомиться, познакомиться, they constantly, those are the standard kind of words in all of these letters. People want to get to know stuff. On the other hand, communities are imagined as highly selective along the lines of certain cultural and ideological spheres and hierarchies. In the absence of direct contact, they are a result of what Anderson called the impact of print technology on the fatal diversity of human language that created the possibility of a new form of imagined community. As Anderson observed regarding the emergence of nations in the context of 19th century capitalism, admittedly, print media contributed to this basic morphology that set the stage for the modern nation. Something similar can be observed in иностранная литература, making accessible the pre-selected set of international literature in Russian translation within the framework of a Soviet periodical. It created possibilities for new and alternative imaginations of communities amongst its readers. This kind of a journal could be connected to Marxist visions of world literature and the Leninist notions of engagement with world culture as a mode of communist life. Again, you can become a communist only when you enrich your mind with a knowledge of all the treasures created by mankind. And Lenin stated this in a 1920s speech that was quoted in the editorial of the inaugural issue of the Russian language иностранная литература. Additionally, this approach links back to the 1930s precedent of the Comintern adjacent internationalist projects of the Moscow-based multilingual international literature, which has been documented and analyzed in great detail already. But unlike the 1930s precedent, the post-war journals were focused on the global circulation, not on the global circulation of world literature, but often enough on one-directional import. And this brings us to part 3. The medium and its circulation beyond the USSR. The Soviet иностранная литература provided a precedent for a specific genre model that could be appropriated and molded to fit local needs elsewhere. It became augmented by domestic literary traditions and institutional structures, as my following discussion of a couple of incidents around the Czechoslovak journal Světová literatura, which is world literature, aims to review. In his 2003 reminiscences on the journal, Józef Szkworecki, one of its editors in the late 50s and later a famous émigré author, in his reminiscences, he pointed out that the journal's foundation was based specifically on the circulation of Soviet authority. The existence of иностранная литература authorized the formation of its Czechoslovak incarnations, and the publication of certain texts in Moscow could serve as the justification for their Czech translations. On the surface, this was not always made explicit. For instance, this is from the editorial of the first issue of Světová literatura in 1956, which was really kind of discreet about politics. International tensions, which have been weighing on humanity since World War II, modern methods of deceitful propaganda on which capitalist states are spending more and more financial means, the lack of direct information, and the mistakes that we ourselves have made in our editorial work and journalistic practice have all contributed to the fact that readers are thirsting for voices from the source. They want to have direct contact with the world. Our journal is intended to allow them to have such closer contact with the world of belles lettres. So this truly is the most outspoken political part of that editorial. And what's interesting about it is that really what it says is, well, there's so much propaganda coming out of places, but what we need is we need to bypass the propaganda and get the real stuff from the places, which is kind of an interesting take. The inaugural issue of which is depicted here of Světová literatura opened with poetry by Federico García Lorca, followed by a 70-page installment of one of the most canonical contemporary Soviet literary works of the time, Book 2 of Mikhail Sholokhev's Spurgeon Soil Upturned. Next, the reader encountered Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which may seem somewhat of a surprise. Of Soviet authors, the following issues prominently featured Sergei Yesenin, Boris Pasternak, Kornei Chukovsky, Vera Panova, and Alexander Green, predominantly early Soviet writers, or those associated with less strict versions of the doctrine of socialist realism, with the exception of Panova. Altogether, the journal's socialist decades hold a wealth of texts that are surprising against the background of commonplace expectations of what was permitted by the socialist censor. Owing to Světová literatura, the world of the Czechoslovak reader was rather open. As a point of orientation, the analysis of a small sample of the journal's bibliographical data, again, which I'm currently processing for a broader analysis, lists, so we have here a set of lists really of annual contributors, it offers us a first glance at historical development. So I broke them down by countries, and can we see the colors? Oh, we can see the colors. Oh, it's small. So if we take the third one in the back, this is contributions from the USSR. And then we have magenta, 1957, is a higher number. Then it goes down the 10 years later significantly. That is the beige bar in the middle. And then it goes up again by the late 1970s. And what happened? Of course, the liberalization culminating in the Prague Spring. Don't have time to go over all of these examples, but there is a pattern emerging. By 1967, the bibliographical index, and I'll go back to this in a moment. By 1967, the bibliographical index for the journal's first decade states, so this is the index that this graph is based on, it states, there's no past analog to Světová literatura, neither regarding the character of the journal nor regarding the number of foreign materials printed. This simple fact forced us to fulfill a new responsibility both to our readership and to literary history, which at least in this case were in rare agreement with each other. this is kind of interesting. Of course, there's a very clear precedent, and the editors of the journal would have been aware of it, but it stopped to matter. Entanglements with the realm of socialist internationalist periodicals seem to be forgotten, at least briefly, as do the political dimensions of Leninist traditions. Indeed, it would be insufficient to cast Svetova Literatura as a Soviet imposition of an example of Soviet cultural hegemony, depriving in the process its Czech editors, administrators, and layout designers of their own agency and history. In the mid-60s, the journal is truly oriented toward the West, whereas content from the USSR and other parts of the socialist world recedes to the background. These are the years of seminal publications like selections from Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which were, of course, tried for obscenity in the same time in the United States. And over the course of a decade, around 10 texts about and by Franz Kafka, such as his letter to the father in '62, which again in the Czechoslovak context was a big deal. By the '70s, the literatures of the socialist world became more dominant. In a way, the period following the Soviet invasion of '68, commonly referred to as the normalization period, seems to have witnessed a more intense streamlining of literary periodicals than the '50s. With the authoritarian turn of the early '70s, many of the central personalities from earlier disappeared from Svetova Literatura, from their pool of authors and translators, including the Josef Škorecký, whom I mentioned earlier. And in the examples like Škorecký, the final reference in the publisher's archives to those who had left the country on the aftermath of the Soviet invasion is a set of fiscal transactions, a paper trail of Odeon depositing unpaid honoraria to the state notary. And I'm bringing this up because I think it's a remarkable kind of, remarkable how this was handled in the Czechoslovak context. So here's one such document that confirms that the state notary is accepting the unpaid royalties for Škorecký. And the reason is, the final typewritten line in this document, the reason is the individual is in an unknown location, or rather he was staying abroad without the state's permission, as an earlier inquiry by the publisher to the police has had to confirm. As Pavel Jaloušek observed in his History of Czech Literature, the '72 launch of the journal Literary Monthly, Literární měsíčník, introduced a periodical most closely aligned with the Soviet model of the thick journal, down to its denomination, something that's going to sound familiar, Orgán Svazu českých spisovatelů, organ of the Czech Writers' Union, which mirrors the organizational belonging of all Soviet journals to the Soviet Writers' Union since its foundation in 1934. Svetova Literatura, on the other hand, was never embedded in this, but belonged to the before-mentioned publishing house Odeon, nominally associated with the anonymous publisher of the first Czechoslovak Republic, so there was an Odeon in the '20s. The archival records of the publishing house reveal really the well-coordinated, and we have great archival records for this, the well-coordinated workings of the state-owned company, down to carefully calculated annual budgets, revenue goals, approval processes for access to foreign currency transaction used for editors' trips abroad, negotiations and transfer of foreign royalties managed through the author rights agency Dilia. Here we have one such example. So if the editors of a journal requested a specific text, Odeon approached Dilia as their intermediary to work with foreign authors and publishers. And then they negotiated and then they paid. For those that are more familiar with the Soviet context, again, this is noteworthy that they asked for permission and paid. To compensate for this, so they paid money, but they also had their own revenue streams. Odeon had a whole program of, for example, art volumes that could be sold in Western Europe in collaboration with, say, Austrian and German publishers, and that brought in some foreign currencies. And this institutional backbone, I believe, and that's the difference from the Soviet example, may have offered the journal a degree of editorial freedom from all too heavy-handed political direction. It was really sheltered in this bureaucratic, or kind of in this business structure. It may have allowed the publisher to operate under the radar of politically mandated publishing portfolios. In fact, again, if we broke down these, if we look at this breakdown, it actually gets much more interesting when we think beyond country of origin. So this USSR bar, the second bar, that is very high for the late 70s. If we were to break it down by language, the majority of these texts are actually not from Russian. They're from other languages of the Soviet Union. So truly, even then, the publisher kind of found ways to bypass potential, what we might imagine as potential demands. Literatura managed to bypass the hierarchies of cultural dominance, and as the last example, I'm going to be quick, will show of permissibility. And in this respect, it leveraged what Ross and Jagov, has called differential censorship. That is the idea that within the cultural space of socialist Eastern Europe, different topics and styles were permissible to the respective censors in different countries in ways that did not always align. Didn't misrepresent. Again, editorial introductions accompanying literary publications helped explain this. And again, the paratextual elements were a central force of the medium as such. In the late socialist era, these forewords explicitly argued for the acceptability of texts on a different level, emphasizing publication elsewhere as legitimization. And here's my one final example, the circulation of one of the most provocative texts of East German literature. I actually read this in high school in Germany. It can serve to illustrate this idea. Ulrich Plenzdorf's The New Sorrows of Young W. First published in the journal Sinn und Form in East Berlin in '72. The story was a literary sensation, if not a scandal in the GDR, not only because it told the story of a young man who defies becoming a productive member of socialist society, but also because it was a rather disrespectful rewriting of a canonical classic, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. In the Soviet Union, Plenzdorf's story was published in December '73, hesitantly so, with an afterword that could preempt criticism. The Soviet background became relevant in Czechoslovakia. First off, the text's 1975 publication in Světová literatura applied the same strategy of including a foreword. Like their counterparts in Moscow, the editors summarized the polemical debates in Germany and assured readers of the text's merit. The Soviet publication in '73 started by noting that the story initially appeared on, I quote here, on the pages of a respectable academic publication. The Sinn und Form was owned or was run by the German Academy of Science. The Czech publication in Světová literatura, on the other hand, referenced a different pedigree, namely the Soviet publication. I quote here, today the story of young W is already known to readers in Hungary and Poland, and the publication of the Writers' Union of the USSR, Inostranная literatura, in '73 printed the Russian translation of Plenzdorf's prose with an informed foreword by Sergei Lvov. Both underscored prestige and ideological pedigree, circulating authority from an external source, relying on specific kind of codes of how this periodical works, the paratextual elements. After all, how would you object to the publication of a text that was approved in Moscow, in East Berlin, where at times censorship was even harsher? So then, the Lives of the Socialist Literary Journal, what I hope to have convinced you through this sightseeing tour across 2 decades of literary periodicals in the USSR and Czechoslovakia is the following. The choice of the literary journal as a key medium for socialist literature, a choice that for the USSR was made self-evidently and then exported together with Soviet socialism. This choice may appear rather arbitrary, but it was consequential. What are basic features of the periodical again? Its necessarily synthetic nature and large communities of contributors and editors invited the formation of distinct social groups of literary producers, clustered with their own patterns, sheltered patterns of agency. With their broad selection of materials, you've all seen the journal, right? You probably got a sense of what was in this one issue. These journals invited readers' selective association and individualized realizations of the journal's diverse content. You could choose what you read and you could make your own conclusion. You could kind of piece together your own version of that journal in the process of reading. Finally, the model was pliable enough to allow for local autonomy and modifications in the Soviet bloc, undermining monolithic impulses of socialist culture. The questions that emerge for me from these observations are the following. How should we revise our understanding of culture in authoritarian societies? Could it be that authoritarian rule was culturally more open than we imagined it? Or, phrased more pessimistically, does this relegate culture to an ornamental role? A role that reduces its relevance to a realm that is detached from democratic modes of governance and freedom? These are questions that aren't reserved for the Cold War era. We might be well advised to continue asking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. We have some time for questions, both from the studio audience and from Zoom. If you have a question on Zoom, I'd recommend you put it in the chat and or raise your hand. If you have a question here, don't put it in the chat, just raise your hand. Would anyone here like to start with a question? Rosen.
So it's a probably simple factual question that arises out of my the depths of my ignorance, but I'm wondering, in terms of your first part, journal as a community, we have probably the story of Nowy Mir has been the one that's told of how that journal really became the heart of the beating heart of the socialism with the human face party. But your example of Darsa remaining is much more interesting in this respect, and I wonder how did that journal, its editorial board and its body of authors came to be associated with the Russian party, having initially, as you show, started, without this kind of politics. And then we have, the example of, for example, October, which was the anti-Nowy Mir, which by the time of perestroika becomes, very much pro-perestroika journal, having shaded its Russian party, or anti-Stalinist. So I'm just wondering, how does a journal evolve into or out of a particular political position?
Yeah.
In terms of its community of the editorial board and authors, how those transitions take place.
So maybe I'll start at the end of your question. It's a really fascinating question. So if you think, and I like to kind of bracket the perestroika part truly, because for me already this mode, that the mode of operation of the Socialist Literary Journal that was in existence for much of Soviet history kind of ended with perestroika. That journal ended already before the end of the Soviet Union, because what happened is, as you pointed out, right, with censorship pulled back, all of a sudden there was a craze to publish anything, right? Anything that was somehow that had been repressed, anything that was interesting in one way or another, and there were some more serious interests, right? Of course, about like rethinking Stalinism or whatnot, and then there were also less serious interests, like reading about sexuality or something. It's a very serious topic, but let me rephrase this. The Soviet reader wanting to read about sex, which then of course continued through the 90s. So, and so truly that mode of organization, because by the late 80s, all of these journals made a run for the interesting things, and then also with circulation of these periodicals, press runs being deregulated, right? We had this huge explosion where multiple of these journals reached truly press runs of 1 million, right? That never had, that were below 100,000 for this much of the 60s and 70s. So that aside, it is interesting, and kind of, I think it really happened with the consistent kind of moving back and forth of people and kind of the people that stuck around within these different communities and imposed their own programs, right? No one ever at the outset said, well, now we're designing this new journal, it's called Nasz Современник, and it should follow this particular political trajectory. So someone like Vikulov would really be meaningful in developing this. And the interesting thing, of course, is that in a way, this does come from Lovimir. Because of course, Twardowski and Vikulov had something in common. They had an interest in the life of, say, in Russian village life, traditions of the Russian peasantry, right? I mean, this is the big stereotype that Twardowski was the muzhik himself. That's why he allowed one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, because it was about a simple man. That's why he allowed Materialny Dvor, which of course is somehow about Soviet modernity destroying the village, right, and Soviet and Russian traditions. So, but then Lovimir kind of didn't quite continue that trajectory, and then we have this branching off, and that is how others that have analyzed, particularly the evolution of Russian nationalist sentiment, they have argued that it actually did come out of Lovimir, and so Vikulov's kind of notion that he is something like a Twardowski character, but not quite, right, makes sense. But it truly emerged kind of with these groups and their persistence in working together. And they drew in kind of people that they somehow connected with in terms of sentiment, aesthetic sentiment, values, right? So Vikulov also, they drew in Yuri Nagibin, who kind of aligned well with these values. There's a beautiful line in his diary. It says, unfortunately, I'm very bad at remember verbatim quotes, but it's from the early 70s. It said, we had an evening at the editorial office of Nasz Современник. We get very drunk. It was very beautiful, very sad, and very Russian. And we talked about the end of the Russian village. That also. So it was all of these things, right? It always comes kind of in these community interactions. I think there is very little in terms of kind of general planning of this should be this in terms of what they, and Oktябrь really is the outlier that has to do with, it was just run by a community that maybe lacked kind of editorial vision. Evgeny Dobryenko has an article about kind of what went wrong in Oktябrь. The idea that they just attached with the party and were like a hardline party journal. They weren't even nationalists. They were just, you know, because that also was kind of an anti-party position. So, and in the process, they kind of failed at doing anything. They just alienated everyone. But then again, the question of not belonging, right? Sorry, that was a lengthy answer. And I hope I covered it all.
Yeah.
Out of the depths of much deeper ignorance than Rosen's ignorance.
Stop being competitive.
We always are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking about, and you know, you showed the 19th century journal, Basic Europa, I think, and I was thinking about, since I'm a little bit more familiar with that kind of universe of journals, the metaphor of kinship struck me as extremely appropriate for that set of for that time period as well, right? And you know, certain things struck me as right. So there we have certain patterns in the 19th century, and I'm curious how they compare, if they compare with the Soviet period. So one such pattern is that you have a diversification of honoraria, right? So various authors will receive various amounts. Some authors were considered to be worthy of more, and certain journals would then break kinship boundaries by pulling out authors from one journal to another and paying them more. So honoraria would be a way in which kinship relationships, right, and commodity relationships broke through kinship relationships. Another pattern that you find in the 19th century case, I think, is a curious relationship with censorship, where yes, the government would adopt particular journals and would sort of sponsor them in various ways, and then sort of stifle the others, if not ban the others altogether. But I think there's a general sense in which everybody is, depending on the historical moment, depending on the situation of the weakening of strengthening of the censorship, you have a sense in which everybody is more or less equally subject to the vagaries of being censored. So these two, right, and of course also issues with kinship emerge as a result of the relationship to the state, right? So relationship to the market, right, and the relationship to the state, sort of how to put it, deform, right, or interfere with kinship relationships. How does it work in the Soviet context by comparison? Is it? Yeah.
So I guess there are a couple of
Mhm.
questions in this, right? One is the question of censorship and a general kind of state intervention into the operation of these journals. And of course, consistently, I mean, it happened very rarely that whole issues had to be pulled or something. The big state interventions happened under Stalin. That was like the campaign against Vista and Leningrad, stuff like that. But of course, by the 60s, by the time I talked about that was not relevant. But at the same time, censorship, of course, censorship isn't only about there's a censor sitting and saying yes or no, but it's also everyone within that system has their own modes of compliance of what they perceive to be acceptable, right? So that's probably much more important for that context. As far as I don't think that necessarily clashed with a kind of community sense between these journals. I think the community sense was truly more of a sense, okay, specific topics belong in specific journals, but also more often than that, because across journals, they were still, the topics were still similar, but specific people belong in specific places. And so the economic dimension isn't really, of course, people got paid, and within one journal, everyone got paid the same by page, right, or by printed sheets. So I think that also didn't interfere as much. What early or what commentators on the journal say over and over again, for example, and Denis Kozlov has shown this quite convincingly in his study of Novi Mir in the 60s, which is a fabulous book, a whole book only about the letters of readers to Novi Mir. But in any case, he talks about that in his comparison to the 19th century. The idea that in the 19th century, these journals were also prototypical political parties in the absence of parliamentary democracy, right? That truly people organized around these, and that's one reason why we can sense that, like, yes, in the 20s, people were kind of intrigued by these journals because truly there were journals that aligned with left causes more than others. But truly, I think that was an important element in the 19th century, right? As if I understand how I understand this, not as much the kinship, or not only the kinship part, but also the kind of the prototypical political party part merged with, again, economic interest. So of course we can't really have that in the Soviet context because, again, these are not truly competing political positions, and why we often want to see kind of these parallels, and similarly, Maguire in his study of Krasnaya Nov, which is kind of still the foundational book about one periodical, if I had to point it out, it would be that study. And he says, well, Krasnaya Nov, this big, thick journal of the 20s, it just mirrored the 19th century in one decade. It went through all the stages of the 19th century journal, he says, and kind of from different phases. One he calls the encyclopedic phase, where it draws all in. And then finally, when it disintegrates and doesn't even have literature anymore, it just kind of talks about general social stuff. But in any case, right? So yes, over and over, this is also to say, over and over, there is a notion of kind of 19th century parallels. And maybe sometimes they're even overemphasized a little. I'm not even sure I'm fully buying into Maguire's argument here. But of course, that's beyond that.
Well, by the sound of it, it seems like you're not really buying into that argument very much, right? Because
of the phases of the
the phases maybe, yeah, I'm not sure, but I mean the kind of the way in which the journal as an institution, right, and as a form of sociality fits into the broader
social
Yeah.
whole,
Yeah.
right, as it were. It sounds like there's strong differences between the way that that works in that.
Yeah, I
In
think,
the
you
19th
know,
century.
in terms of kind of how these things were explicitly elaborated.
Right.
And again, no one in the chat would sit down, like, we are gonna do X,
But
Y, Z.
just the idea that
Different
everybody
standards.
gets paid the same within the journal.
Yeah, yeah,
That
of
was
course.
not at all the case
Yeah.
in the 19th
Yeah.
century, right?
I mean,
People
if you published in a provincial journal, then.
Right.
But if you published in a Moscow-based journal, that would be more desirable. Of course, careers generally went, you know, you wanted to publish in the Moscow-based journal, which is also really interesting. When I talked about the 1950s, there was this whole flood of every kind of major city in the Soviet Union restarted their new monthly or bi-monthly journal, where you wonder, it's like, who read these? Because truly, all the good stuff, people generally tried to get to Moscow, including for financial reasons. But people were loyal to these journals. I did an interesting this is a while ago in Russia, clearly a while ago. I did a thing. I used to go around and buy old journals. There's like a Russian eBay version of sorts, Avita. And so I would always meet people that had interesting old journals to sell, and usually it's like sketchy meetup at the, well, actually not that sketchy, it's safe, at the metro. But then also when I was in Voronezh, there was a local journal there, Padyom, and I bought a number. Actually, the man that I bought them from, he had made them into volumes himself. They were kind of sad because they were like handmade and they half fell apart. Like he didn't have the means, and then we had a conversation about this. Well, there was that part about the materiality that I was really interested in. And I said, well, you know, where he explained why he did this. But then I also said, well, what about Padyom? He said, well, obviously we all read that. I'm like, well, why? Well, obviously, you know, there was no like, it wasn't like that was where the best texts were, but truly, again, this notion of like, well, you've got to be loyal to your own stuff, and you do that because that's what we do here. So this is to say, right, there were, again, these kind of maybe not fully rational approaches. Of course, this is more on the side of anecdotal evidence, so I don't want to overemphasize it, but it plays along the same lines. Truly the most interesting book he had made, and he explained, well, there weren't enough books around, so we made our own. And he had cut out of the weekly Aganyok magazine that had art reproductions, and he had cut out the art reproductions for like a decade and put them in a tome that he had glued together. And it was like upside down and a little bit. I have it at home, and I treasure it. Yeah, so.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the paratext, sort of the formal scope of that. Specifically, kind of wondering, you know, you brought it up in terms of, you know, forewords, afterwards, photos of the author. I was wondering first, kind of how far this of a scope kind of do you apply that term paratext? You know, is an editorial board's you know, release or announcement at the beginning of the journal, is that paratext or is that the text? And then kind of, you know, I think that was mostly in the section about literary reception, which makes perfect sense in terms of a forward, afterward photos. Do you also see this kind of paratext as an opportunity to think about kind of the other side of that and sort of the maybe formal preoccupations or politics or what have you of the people kind of behind the scenes and how what paratext they're kind of including in a particular journal?
I'm not 100% certain. So maybe just start. So this general idea of paratext, right? The paratext, Gerard Genet, the paratext being the stuff that brings a text into being, essentially, right? So clearly every text needs like the bibliographical information, it needs a headline, it needs information on the author, so everything that is beyond. Periodical studies scholars have kind of broadened this term, and they talk about periodical codes, and it really introduces that idea, okay, what brings the text into being as a periodical? So that, and for them, really, that is much more than what Genet ever wanted, I think, or than it had occurred to him. They're looking at paper, advertising, illustration, right? They're looking, and then they're even going beyond, and this is in particular the big 4-volume Oxford history of modern periodicals that has in its introduction that kind of elaborates these periodical codes and says, well, even the social environment is a kind of paratext, right? So which kind of goes in that direction. And truly that is kind of which at different moments I probe in different ways. So not so much, I mean, today really more focused on forwards, but at other moments, for example, question of how does illustration, right? How does illustration work and how it envisions readerly engagement? What can I do with a journal, right? And there's again, that's the beauty of a periodical, that you can do a lot of things with it, and people did a lot of things. In the Soviet Union, people tore out pages, right? People put, if you want to decorate your dorm room, I mean, there are undergraduates in the audience, maybe, I don't know, but you know, you would have torn out like pages of art reproductions if you didn't put them in your self-made coffee table. Right, so there's all these affordances. That's another kind of periodical studies work, right? All these affordances that these periodicals brought about, that people somehow realized in a broad variety of ways, which again, that is kind of the specificity of the medium, that you can do so many things with it. If you had a book, well, you're done, right? You got a book and you put it on the shelf. But the periodical, you can do much more. Anyone that ever shares like a Sunday Times or whatever you read with someone else at the breakfast table knows that, because those other people usually kind of abuse the newspaper in the wrong ways, and then you get. But yeah, so I think there is a huge kind of debate around these questions of like paratext or what's kind of beyond the paratext in periodicals, including them. And that's where, for me, I'm a little lost with the periodical studies approach to paratext, where it says, well, the social is a paratext. Well, maybe we can discuss the social simply just in different terms. Yes, that was my attempt at least, right? But yeah, so there's a lot of there, even if you think about tables of content, right? This again, that tells the reader, how do you navigate this journal? How are you supposed to read it? How are you supposed to find things? And there are different visions of that. In the 20s, the most conservative journals were really bad at telling you. They weren't user-friendly. No one could figure out what was going on. The idea was that you were the educated reader that read from cover to cover, and then you're done. And of course, much later in Soviet history, it got much more lively, right? And then you had the chess problems, or truly, again, this is the Journal of Autowinish, information on how to prepare vegetables in a healthy manner, stuff like that. Yeah.
I think it was for, yeah, our last question.
On the question of, I mean, this is specifically about иностранная литература, foreign literature, and its counterparts in Eastern Europe. You know, it is often said about иностранная литература that the most important contemporary foreign texts were first published there before making it to standalone book format. But I never understood the extent of this phenomenon, because obviously one journal could not have covered the entirety of the literary translation process of contemporary literature. Granted, I mean, it was much more sensitive to trends and probably was important to introducing authors, if not in their entirety, just. But I'm just wondering whether you have a qualitative sense of what portion of contemporary foreign literature bypassed иностранная литература, maybe being introduced in maybe slightly more haphazard way in some other journals, or being published directly in book form, and whether you notice any general principles of this bypassing, and whether sorry, the questions are piling on, but whether иностранная литература played the same structure, you know, was feature, and you know, these other East European journals played structurally the same role.
Right. So I think this is interesting, and I don't have, this is another kind of, if one wanted to kind of collect the data and develop a very clear vision of how publication of foreign literature, translation of foreign literature in book form worked in the Soviet Union, I think that could reveal a very interesting kind of paths of what you're saying. What's the path from journal to book publication? Of course, so for the Soviet author, again, this is going back to our poor friend Zubin. Right? As a Soviet author, you wanted it. You wanted to first publish in a journal because you'd get royalties once, and then you publish as a book, you'd get royalties twice. For the foreign authors, that's not really desirable because they were not part of that literary system anyways, right? So that motivation is not there. How much kind of that really happened, what the kind of the pipeline was from like journal to book, I'm not clear about. What I am fairly clear about is that, you know, of course, other journals publish literature and translation. Nowy Mir published Anna Zegers, or, you know, the serious stuff from German or whatever. But then also, this is actually might be one of the reasons why people did read those regional journals, because Иностранная литература couldn't really publish like what the kind of the popular reader, I mean, still popular and mass literature is tricky here, but kind of what we would think as more of a genre literature, detective novels, right? They didn't really, every now and then they did, like they published Georges Simenon, and then half the readers got really angry. As soon, truly, in letters from the readers, always, as soon as there's a murder in the text, it's like, no, this is not worthy literature. Well, where would you go for your Agatha Christie? You would go to the journal Dawn, right? One of the regional journals. So Ural, that's where that happened, right? So there were kind of, everyone had figured out their own section. At the same time, also in Иностранная литература, even they had a notion of like, this is a race. We gotta get to it before Nowy Mir scoops it up, because they could, and there's no reason why they wouldn't, right? So truly there was a notion of competitive, but of course Иностранная литература was ultimately the kind of the hub and home of that kind of literature. So, and then as far as the rest of Central Europe, say, is concerned, I think within that was also kind of the point I was trying to make, right? Within that familiar shell, there were a number of different paths toward this. And I think this is kind of something that I'm very interested in. This is actually part of the next project that truly is about Odeon and Svetova Literatura and that relationship that is more entangled. Odeon essentially functioned as a publisher for literature and translation in Czechoslovakia more than there was by the 60s and 70s, that wasn't as clear anymore in the Soviet Union what book publisher was responsible for that. So that is something, and others, I think a lot of stuff is happening along those lines, hopefully, as far as, say, the Polish equivalent or the Hungarian equivalent or the Ukrainian equivalent are concerned, right? So more to come.
Well, thank you for this talk and for the answers to the questions. And once again, it was great to have you here. So.
Thank you so much.